Human resource employees, what are your best HR nightmare stories? So I am on the HR team that supports a wide variety of US cities for our company, including our colorful Florida locations. This is the best story I heard. We had some woman trying to avoid work by sitting out in her car in the parking lot. While she was hiding out there, she needed to use the restroom. Well, instead of going back inside or doing literally anything else, she decides to pee outside of her car window. Even though I am also a woman, I was impressed and disgusted by the physics behind this feat. She had stuck her bare ass outside the window and just went for it. Well, unbeknownst to her, her male coworker arrived at work late due to an appointment. He drove past to find a parking spot as this was happening and got full view. He then reported the incident to us. One of our HR people had to investigate this, and sure enough, parking lot cameras could corroborate his story. Our HR person confronted the woman, and her response was, "Well, how did you know it was me? It could have been anyone." And we thought, okay, fair enough. The cameras aren't CSI grade zoom, so we only saw the ass part. It was harder to completely identify the face. So we went back to the male peer and asked how he knew it was her. His response, "Oh, it was definitely her. The face tattoos are pretty recognizable." And yeah, we definitely don't get paid enough for this. Edit. For you investigative sleuths out there, our cameras are not as amazing as you think they are. It's a parking lot, not the White House. The one camera that caught the event didn't have hyper zoom on the license plate. That's why we have a witness. Next story. Came into work early for a morning shift. I work in an industrial lab. Heard noises from the back corner of the office portion of the building, but can't make out what they are because of distortion. I head that way to see what was going on as I was the only one there, so I thought, at 3 a.m., and I see my lab manager effing the district manager, her boss, while the HR rep for the district is sitting there, enjoying the view. I noped and went to the lab and tried to forget what happened. Next story. Saw a guy blatantly lie in his recruitment form. Watching him fill it out in front of me, it was total bollocks. Apparently, he was 15th in line to the throne and went to Easton, studied at Oxford, and served in the army for 9 years after training at Sandhurst. Not bad for a 21-year-old who had in fact spent 3 years in a young offenders institute battling a drug problem. Next story. My friend was doing hiring for a staffing agency during college. A guy who we went to high school with came in looking for a job. He told the candidate that he had 2 jobs. One paid $10 an hour and the other paid $11. The only thing was that the $11 an hour job requires a drug test, and if you fail the drug test, you can't get either. He said he wanted the 11-hour job. Now, we knew him well enough to know that he liked smoking, so my friend reiterated the drug test fail rule. Dude said he was good on Friday to make the test on Monday. Well, come Monday, he took the drug test. And he pissed for hot weed, cocaine, amphetamines, and some other crap that's supposed to get it out of your system in 48 hours. Next story. My job is a constant HR nightmare. Boss has slept with coworker A. Coworker A is married to coworker B. Coworker B and A have been married, unhappily, for 10 years or something now. B has no idea, even though B invites boss over for dinner once every other week. Then, boss is now dating new coworker, who's my best friend, and has already gifted her $2,000 despite another coworker suffering from cancer and barely being able to pay the bills when he was still working. And then, my other boss, who owns the other lesser half of the company, has called me a narcissist in a meeting. Told me literally, there are no such thing as business ethics, and that's barely been the past couple of months. Been there for 4 years. And sorry, I'm not HR. We don't have one. Next story. Okay, I want to work at this place. I don't know why, but it's calling to me. Okay, I just want to see what's going on. I probably wouldn't get a lot done, and I don't feel like I would get in trouble for it. I feel like I could coast by under the radar and just get all the drama, okay? I want some gossip in my life. Okay, that's why I do these videos. Next story. So, not in HR, but my previous senior manager was renowned for sleeping with colleagues. He was married with kids. Before I started there, I remember seeing a huge banner plastered across a footbridge that everyone leaving work by car had to drive under to get to the motorway. The sign said Joe Bloggs was a cheating bastard. Turns out he was cheating on his wife with a team leader from another department and was cheating on his mistress with another team leader from yet another department. Both the team leaders found out about each other and had a massive fight in the reception of the building. By the time I started at the company, both of the team leaders were no longer working there. Next story. I work in recruitment, so not exactly HR. A guy had applied for a job that required a DBS check, police check, and he filled the DBS and all his other checks flew through. The DBS came back as he had committed a crime in the past. Now, on our end, only the guy who will be applicant's manager and a senior in our department can see the DBS result. He called the department unhappy that the job had been withdrawn. He then sent a long email in begging for another chance. He said when he was 17, he beat 2 women up, threatened the cops with a gun. We're in the UK, so guns are pretty rare, especially in the 1970s. And then he went into detail about the attempted essay. This dude wanted a job at a hospital. That's a no, mate. Next story. I was sitting in the HR office with one of the members of HR. I was waiting on her to finish a form so that we could go eat lunch. Suddenly, this guy comes in. He was a young temp employee and had only been there for a week or so, and says he has something he needs to talk about. I start to get up to leave when he blurts out that he doesn't like the fact that there are so many gays and lesbians working in the company. Once he says that, I sit right back down. The HR employee asks him to clarify, and he goes on about how his trainer was gay, and his team lead is gay, and his manager is a lesbian. All true, and he doesn't feel comfortable working around all these gays and lesbians. The HR employee then asks him if anyone has ever sexually harassed him, which he says they haven't. She then says, "So you want me to fire these employees strictly based on their sexual orientation, just so you don't feel uncomfortable?" And he says yes. After which, she tells him to leave the office. She then calls his manager and talks with her about it, and he ends up quitting by the end of the week. Next story. My friend who worked in HR told me about her old job where the boss had drilled a hole from his office through to the ladies' changing rooms and was a perv whacking it every chance he could get. They found out because someone saw light through the hole as he took the cover off for a peek. He denied everything though, and they had to take a DNA sample from the carpet under the hole, which confirmed it was A, him, and B, that he had indeed been whacking away. Next story. So I don't work in HR, but I do have a nightmare HR story. When I was on my gap year, I worked a part-time job as a fitness instructor at a leisure center. One of my coworkers, we can call him Bill, was a nice guy, and I would often sit and chat with him on my breaks, etc. Long-term girlfriend and baby at home. Now, as a part of my job, I used to teach spinning classes on a fairly regular basis. I would normally leave my phone in the staff room while I was teaching or behind the reception desk. Both of these places were secure, by the way, and my phone had a passcode on it. I didn't want it going off while I was teaching because when it received calls and text messages, it interfered with the stereo in the spin studio, and I didn't have a locker or anything where I could store it. Well, sometime in around January, I was at university for an interview weekend. My girlfriend at the time had to come pick me up, and while she was waiting in the car, she was scrolling through my messages on my iPad. When I got in the car, she showed me one of my chats and simply said, "Why did you send this video to Bill?" I had no recollection of sending any videos to Bill since I did not speak to him outside of work beyond "I'm going to be late" or something like that. I thought it was a mistake, but as I scrolled further back up, I saw that I had sent this same video to Bill a couple of weeks prior. Feeling thoroughly perplexed, I clicked into the video and saw it was a video of me, 20F, and my girlfriend, 26F, on holiday in Thailand. I'd like to stress that it was not a sexual video, we were just joking around, but we had just gotten out of the shower and were both naked. And at this point, I'm still thinking it's some kind of big mistake as Bill is a nice guy with a baby at home. However, I look a little closer and realize that the dates and times of when I had sent these videos were at times I was teaching spin classes, and therefore had left my phone unattended. So Bill, being the sicko he was, had obviously seen me put my passcode into my phone during all the times we had been sat chatting on breaks, etc., and had memorized it. He had then taken the opportunity to scroll through all of my personal photos and videos when I had left my phone unattended to go and teach classes. I'm assuming that he had deleted the video once, hence why he had sent it to himself again a couple of weeks later. He'd also deleted the chat history from my iPhone, but did not realize it synced to my iPad. This was around 2012, by the way. I would have only been around 18 or 19 at the time when the videos were taken. Obviously, I reported this to my HR manager and to HR, but it was a bit of a minefield for them to navigate. I don't know what he told them, but I imagine it was along the lines of saying I sent them to him of my own free will. How would he have known my password, etc.? It took a long while to get sorted, but in the end, he did get sacked. Thankfully, the police also paid him a visit, so I'm sure he had some explaining to do to his significant other. Next story. I had a bookkeeper that paid himself 2 checks every week. We did not catch it for a year. Another bookkeeper quit and files for unemployment. He then claimed a claim with EEOC that he had a disability and we failed to make accommodations for him. The disability was alcoholism and the accommodations were leaving early to attend AA meetings. Seriously, we had to hire a lawyer to fight that. Then a guy hurt himself on the first hour of the first day of work. He claimed he fell and hit his head on the wall. He was out for 3 weeks on workman's comp from the concussion. Then, when he came back on light duty, he could only do desk work but managed to fall again in the crowded bathroom and hit his head again. It took me 9 months to get rid of him. It turns out that was not his first rodeo. When I called his former employer, the lady I spoke to made an offhand comment about workplace accidents and head injuries and the importance of cameras in the workplace. And then finally, while doing a remodel of a museum, one of my employees helped himself to a gun that was on display. It was very ugly and embarrassing for everyone. My company was kicked off the job and banned from working there ever again. I fired the guy, and he filed a discrimination claim with EEOC because I did not fire the whole crew, just him. Next story. The workers had races with those motorized forklifts. One did not know that there was freshly poured concrete, got the forklift stuck in it, damage was 100,000 euros, big foundation for a new storage facility. According to the union contracts, such damages are paid for by the company unless it was intentionally done. So I walked into my boss's office and told him about the situation. And he's like, okay, OP, can you please return to your office for a while? And I say, okay. Then, as soon as I was at my desk, I hear the loudest obscenity from his office. Then my phone rang, and he told me to inform the insurance, which ended up paying less than $10K worth of the damage. Otherwise, the usual HR nightmare is just people not keeping their documents in order. Next story. I used to work for a company that was an HR nightmare. Several events occurred. I was hired as a director of quality/regulatory, so I come in and start sprucing up documents, policy, and all the essential stuff. Then a VP of sales doesn't take too kindly to me fixing the stuff that they were lying, fraud about, and tells me in front of HR, "I'm going to make you so miserable that you quit this job." Still works there. Then another sales guy went into a coma, it was a health issue, and the higher-ups decided that they could fire him to keep their insurance cheaper and not pay out his life insurance. Luckily, HR pointed out the potential lawsuit. After they debated the cost of the lawsuit and whether they could win, they kept him on until he passed away a week later. Then when I left, I eventually had my own company, and they decided that they owned any IP I created when I was employed there. But I had no contract, and non-competes are not legal in my state. And then the C-level employees were all convicted of corruption in multiple countries and are now in jail. Next story. I had a friend working a GM when HR thought it was a good idea to test everyone on the skill set needed for the department, regardless of how long they were in the position. Long careers, 15, 20, 25 years, were ruined because even though they worked there for a long time with a long string of great performance reviews, they didn't pass the test that measured what HR thought was required for the department. Let's say you're a materials expert working in a design department. You may know barely enough in the CAD system to draw a cylinder. On the other hand, given a cylinder, you can whip out all the properties that cylinder would have if it were made from aluminum, cold-rolled steel, fiberglass, etc. You'd be out of your job because HR said you'd have to have a certain level of CAD expertise, even if it wasn't relevant to your role in the design process. Next story. I was asked to translate for some visitors from the parent company at a celebration held by HR. I stopped translating around the time the director of HR started asking overly personal sexual questions to the two young HR office ladies. A couple of days later, during a private bullcrap session, I recounted the story to a friend who happened to be a director from the parent company. He then put on his professional hat and asked me to write it up and submit a complaint to the parent company's HR. Nightmare ensued. Local head of HR had been in charge of the sexual harassment avoidance training that had narrowly saved them from a lawsuit. Then, CEO of local company insisted that I bring the story out in public and speak to the director of HR like an adult. Parent company HR brought in HR from another local subsidiary to perform an investigation. It became painfully obvious who the whistleblower was, and nothing came of the investigation that I heard about. But the next year was made to be a living hell for me by the local company. Even the office lady who had been the subject of the sexy inquisition resented the fact that she was in the center of a controversy. And I left that company as soon as I possibly could and was not saddened to hear of their bankruptcy and partition a couple of years later. They had other issues as well. Next story. I work in HR, and we recently moved from one HRIS system to another. System manages personal information like benefits, time off requests, contact information, etc. And part of the teaching is teaching the workforce how to use the application. There are a lot of challenges, including the boomers who are technology illiterate, employees who speak very little English, and managers who think learning the system is below their pay grade. Now, I'm normally pretty patient with the language barrier. I mean, it's not like I am bilingual either, so if they have the basics of English as a second language, they already know more than I do. So this one fine day, I had a constrained team of employees trying to figure out how to access the system in their phones, despite the step-by-step written and pictorial instructions, when I have this one older individual ask me to help him. Well, nothing but XXX hardcore adult content content would come up on his smartphone browser. He legit couldn't understand why I couldn't help him. The browser just kept going back to adult content no matter what I typed in. I usually feel like I can figure people's phones out, but I reached my limit. I couldn't tell if the poor guy had a virus on his phone or if he was effing with me. Creepy old guy, my father's age, barely speaks English and not embarrassed by the raunchy adult content stuck on his screen. I told him to go get his phone cleaned up and don't come back with it until he fixed it. And I haven't seen him since. Next story. Not HR myself, but a coworker of mine is undoubtedly one. I'll call him Jay, and I'll preface this by saying yes, these are true stories with some details omitted to protect both our identities, and that I don't know how he's managed to stay employed for 15 plus years. My closest guess is because he outlasts all the managers that he gets his final warning from. He's outlasted at least 5 managers. Also, this isn't America, and the age of consent here is 16, by the way. So my first month into my job, Jay comes into the crowded staff room with his phone and earphones plugged in. The door leading to the outside area was locked, so he sat in the middle of the staff room and spoke to a woman on his phone. I finish up my break and headed back to work, whereupon a few minutes later, the HR lead leads my manager Jay, Jay's sister, our coworker, and our assistant manager to her office. I wasn't told anything by them. However, I'd just spent my break talking to a woman from another department who was also on break long enough to see what had happened. Well, Jay had started dirty talking a naked woman on his phone in the middle of the staff room and was egging her on to show him more, while still in the crowded staff room, and one of the other employees looked over his shoulder to confirm what he was doing, then reported him to HR. He was monitored on break for a week or so, then back to normal. Then, after a year of me working there, we got help from a 16-year-old student who would work on weekends. Well, Jay has a history of shady business with younger women. He wanted to run away with a 16-year-old Welsh girl he met on a dating app and harassed a high school Burger King server every day until she quit, but he was assigned to work late at night with her one night, just the two of them. A couple of days later, we're informed that an incident has caused Jay to be suspended for 2 weeks. Eventually, he came back and accidentally let some details slip that led to us piecing together that he'd acted inappropriately and sexually harassed her to the point that she reported and then filed a restraining order against him. He was suspended but came back early because she quit. Likely, she wasn't happy that they didn't do much until she literally got a restraining order against him. But that time, he seemed to have finally learned his lesson. We had a new girl about 18 to 19 start working there, and she said that he never speaks to her when they are working together. Even when she'd ask a question, he would just stare awkwardly, laugh, and wander off. They still assign him to work with her despite his past offenses because of staff shortages and, in my opinion, mismanagement. Next story. The nightmare of an HR employee potentially causing the HR nightmare. I took a grad course meant to prep future school principals on HR stuff. One of our assignments was to ask our current principal for redacted copies of disciplinary letters that they'd written to use as examples to practice writing our own. This assignment seemed sketchy from the get-go, but whatever, it's grad school and I won an A. The course was taught by the HR director who helped hired me and my building principal in the same school year. Well, the principal didn't have any letters from before I started there, so just gave me a couple of random ones. Somehow, the professor was still surprised when I came to class knowing all the details of each write-up despite the absence of detail in the letters. Well, the principal flipped out a little because he was worried the principal had broken some confidentiality rule. It was actually that I just happened to be friends with the two people that had been written up. Teacher is an HR nightmare unto itself. Next story. Oh boy, where do I start? One employee wouldn't work once because it got dark because he was scared of ghosts. In the interview, he asked if the building was haunted. He was from Asia and refused to listen to a woman boss. If I asked him to do something, he would say, okay, and then literally stuff the task between files and storage so I couldn't find it. If my husband asked him to do something, he couldn't jump high enough up his ass to get it done. He accused every single employee of sexually harassing him, and his wife didn't appreciate it. I asked for examples. The 55-year-old woman, who was as sweet as a grandma, asked him what cologne he was wearing. It smelled like he wore the whole bottle. I was looking for employees when a friend suggested I hire him, and I said we already had, and it wasn't working well due to his wife's complaints. Her response, "Wife? He's gay, haven't you met his husband?" Apparently to our work events, he was bringing his sister as his wife. Then after he worked for us, he applied for a job elsewhere and listed my husband as a reference. A woman called to do a check and my husband told her he didn't work with him, that I did, but she wouldn't talk to me because my name wasn't listed. She asked him a few questions about his duties, and my husband explained his duties. Long pause on the other end, and she was like, "That's not what he has listed," he said. To which my husband said, "Those were my duties as manager/business owner, and he never had access to such positions." And then he went on to explain to her this guy would never take direction from me, and she quickly ended the conversation. Then, before we invested in cameras, we had one season where money theft was constantly happening, and we had an idea who it was but couldn't catch her. She manipulated us. It was my first year, and I was naive. She always had a new or fake type of cancer for reasons for missing work. Then one day a client came storming into my office and said her and several others would take their business away if we didn't terminate her. Now, not being from this area, I didn't have any background except her reference check. Well, turns out she's stolen money and credit card numbers from various places of employment, but she's never been charged because she's always apologized or repaid it back. So then, the missing money made sense, and we were right. Once we got rid of her, the money stopped disappearing. She reapplied later on, and her resume was so padded, I turned it into a drinking game. The duties that she put down under her position at my business either 1, didn't exist, or 2, were my job. When you pad your resume, you don't send it to a previous employer. Then one employee developed a drinking problem. I couldn't figure out why for the life of me they were going outside every 15 minutes for a cigarette. I dismissed it at first because they were a hard worker putting in long hours and barely took a lunch break. But then I was finding alcohol bottles hidden in places, and on the day I caught it, they had also overdosed on an antidepressant medication, and I had to rush them to the ER and help hold them down as they kept trying to strip and run. They were admitted to the psych ward. I didn't hear anything for days, and then one day they just showed back up. The hospital let them out on day passes to come back to work because they would be in the hands of a responsible adult. This wasn't cleared or discussed with me, though, at all. Then one girl started off great, on time, professional, great office etiquette. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. One day she went out for her smoke break and forgot to come back. I asked her the next day what happened, and she looked at me dazed and confused and said she did come back. I showed her the time clock and camera, and she said she had no idea what happened. She started missing shifts, and one busy Friday didn't show up and I couldn't get a hold of her. Another employee had gone on lunch and said she was outside our office drunk, laying in the street. I went out there to talk to her, and she was adamant she didn't work for that day. Her glasses were broken, and she was scraped up with 2 very large men who were intimidating. Then she ran away from me, missed her Saturday shift, emailed me Sunday saying she'd been in the hospital with a liver infection and would be in Monday with a note. Well, I asked for the note both Monday and Tuesday, and she ran home to get it and never came back. She didn't remember seeing me when she was drunk, apparently, and she was still wearing her broken glasses. Honestly, I could keep going on and on. One girl I have given chance after chance, but after missing 17 shifts and then showing up drunk to talk about it, I was done. But don't worry, she claimed she wasn't drinking, she was just around people who were drinking, so that's why she smelled. Okay, so does OP and her husband own this place or something? Or are they management? What's going on here? Do they encourage a drinking work environment? That would be kind of funny a little, but not that funny, but what's going on here? Who are these people you're hiring? Something about this particular job speaks to the heart of alcoholics, and I would like to know what it is. But anyway, next story. We had a guy in one of our stores submit a grievance to us about how we were discriminating against him because we were giving a female 7 months pregnant colleague some extra breaks. She had a medical note confirming the reasonable adjustments needed, but this was so she could sit down for an extra 5 minutes every so often, because he was unable to get pregnant, so could not take advantage of the same extra breaks. Didn't really know where to start with that one. Next story. Government employer. Agency management fired a popular program manager with about 250 employees under him who all love him. He's entitled to a public hearing about his dismissal if he desires, which he demands, after his HR meeting and his private hearing before the agency brass. So everybody packs into the auditorium. All 250 of his employees are there to advocate for him. His lawyer gives an opening statement about how he's been fired for caring too much and for refusing to cut corners the agency brass wanted cut, and for protecting his people from politicians trying to score political points and blah, blah, blah. Cheers from the crowd. Well, our HR director stands up, and she is booed. She informs the hearing that the guy forged every single one of his employees' required by law assessment forms that determined raises and promotions. He forged signatures of all 250 people there and filled the forms randomly. She puts examples of the forgery up on screen. It's obvious. He ran out of time and didn't want to get reprimanded for disorganization, a long-running but minor problem with him, so he forged a crap ton of government documents. So, 250 people walked right out of the hearing. furious. He hadn't told any of them the real reason he got fired. He told them it was random retaliation for being awesome. He knew the agency had all of this evidence. It had been presented to him twice before, and he had admitted he had done it. It was insane. I guess he figured he had nothing to lose by punting. He became such a pariah, and he had to move. Next story. One place I used to work, one of the upper management guys who was in charge of the warehouse would hop on the forklifts and do donuts. He had colon cancer and was always having surgeries to remove another section of colon, so he had a colostomy bag. He would squeeze air out of his colostomy bag while he was doing donuts on the forklifts. It would waft this god-awful stench everywhere. Everyone thought it was hilarious and would immediately run outside for a smoke break until the scent dissipated. The smell was bad enough it made a coworker puke. Also, had another manager there eat 6 10-stacks of White Castle sliders for lunch. He ate the last 10-stack on the toilet. I have no idea how he could eat with the sounds and stenches he was emitting from his other end. It sounded like someone was trying to drown Donald Duck in a puddle with a tooting tuba. No one went into that bathroom for the rest of the day. Next story. Manufacturing. Long story short, the company uses some pretty dangerous equipment and machines. The manufacturing floor and warehouse had started to have some safety issues, so they decided to start doing random drug tests. 60% failed, including the best friend of the owner. This same person was responsible for several of the safety issues mentioned above and was directly responsible for 2 people being injured while on the job due to negligence on his part. So what did HR do? Nothing. The owner was one of the people that failed. Next story. I haven't been able to tell this story for so long. So I managed this smaller company and also served as the HR guy. Had this one employee who needed rides to work for a short while, so I would pick him up when he needed one. One day I go to pick him up, and as we are driving away, he very calmly tries to explain that one of the employees of the company we were servicing had approached him, saying that another one of our employees basically cornered her in the break room and kept trying to get close to her, flexing by saying he had family that were higher-ups in the company that she worked for, and kept trying to ask where she lived for some effing reason. There was more to it that I can't quite remember, but basically he was hitting on her hard. Once he said trapped her in the break room though, I U-turned and sped back to the site, running frantically inside and finding the girl, who I actually knew from high school somewhat vaguely. I pulled her aside and asked her about what happened, and she repeated basically the same thing to me. Thing is, the guy is married, but the way she quoted him, it definitely sounded like she was telling the truth. And we had 0 problems up to this point. I had no reason to believe she would just do this out of nowhere. I apologized profusely and told her she would never have to see him here again, and she was very kind and understanding. Then, with the other employees still in my car, I speed to the other guy's house, let's call him Dan, and knock on his door. He answers, and immediately I demand the keys for the on-site vehicle. Once he hands them over, I unleash hell. And I say, so I heard this interesting story that you wouldn't leave this girl alone, and you kept trying to ask where she lived, and you wouldn't let her leave the break room. And then he immediately glances back over his shoulder because his wife is nearby in the kitchen and comes to outside and closes the door. And he talks in whispers. I didn't talk to anyone. Well, they have cameras, so how about I go ask security to take a look? And then Dan starts trying to guide me over to the parking lot away from his front door as his wife cracks it open to listen in on what's going on. I was in the break room with some chick, but I didn't do anything except say hello and asked if I would be in her way for cleaning. And I was pissed. I could tell by the way he was acting he was desperate for me not to say anything. And I say, I find it odd that we had the location for over a year, and a week after I put you there, I get the first harassment complaint I've ever had to deal with. Then he starts getting all puffy-chested saying crap like, how dare you question my integrity, and won't even hear my side of the story. And I say, so were you blocking the doorway so she could leave or not? No. So I shrug, and I say, okay, fine. I'm going back to work, and I'm going to look at the cameras, and if I see otherwise, then you're fired. Then I start walking away, and he shouts, then I'm effing done, man. And I say, great, pick up your last check tomorrow from work so I don't have to effing deal with you ever again. And this guy was in pain. Twice my age, this was his second job, always tried to make himself seem vital while he would also complain about any job I put him on. It all just kind of came out right then and there. So I leave and ignore the argument between he and his wife that breaks out, and I get into my car and drive off. Other employee riding with me breaks the silence with, so we're good, right? Anyways, went back and saw footage of him definitely obstructing the doorway when she was obviously trying to get out. Several minutes of conversation, no sound, just passage of time. But effing creep, man. Passed by him at the store the other day, but this happened a couple of years ago. Next story. Oh, finally, all my misery is worth it. Here are just a few from my many years working in HR startups. First, we hired a very senior person for management team, and for his work visa, I needed a copy of his university degree. Followed up repeatedly, and he kept making excuses like, "Oh, I just moved, I need to find where I put it," or "I need to see if it's in the basement at my parents' place." Well, turns out he had lied on his CV. He resigned immediately. Then, CEO had threesomes with employees and ordered Coke taxis to the office. Next, head of HR went on maternity leave, so the CEO seized the opportunity to only look internally for the role and chose solely based on who he wanted to have sex with, which he then did. Then, after a company party, the toilets and sinks in the woman's bathroom were all backed up. Plumber found multiple condoms stuffed down the sink and flushed down the toilets. We had found hand and footprints on the walls and tiles, and the security cams showed the last people leaving the office to be 3 straight men in relationships. Then, at a company retreat, an employee did too many mushrooms and shat himself on the beach in front of the entire company. At the same retreat, 3 employees cheated on their partners, and there was 1 divorce. And finally, when we found out the developers never washed their glasses, just rinsed them and put them back on the shelf. Next story. Not HR, but I had a coworker at a bakery who quit in a most spectacular fashion. She was quirky to say the least. So the first time I met her, I was shoulder deep in a big bowl of buttercream when I felt a hard slap on my ass. I turned around, totally shocked, my arm covered in frosting, to see a total stranger. She grinned and said, "Hey girlfriend, which one's your favorite Prince song?" And I said I wasn't sure, and she responded, "Me neither, but if I had to pick, I'd take broccoli over asparagus any day." Then one day she was working up front making coffees and helping customers and what have you. She was in the midst of filling the honey container that went out for customers to use for their coffees. And this was a messy, sticky job, as the honey came in a 50-pound tub and it needed to go into one of those tiny bears. Then our manager asked her to come back for a second. I was back by the ovens pulling out a rack of cookies, and I overheard the manager informing her that she was being written up for tardiness, which was fair as she was 15 to 30 minutes late every day. He asked her to sign a document saying that she'd been informed of the write-up so it could go in her file. Well, girlfriend lost her mind and she started shouting and insulted everything from his choice of shoes to his wife's hair to the way he walked. She then threw her hat at him, ripped off her shirt, buttons and all, tossed it on his desk while shouting, "I quit your dumbass job," and then she proceeded to take off her pants as well, tossed them in the guy's face, and left. She walked across the bakery through a line of customers, across the parking lot, and out to the bus to wait for the bus while shouting, wearing only her undergarments and smeared with sticky honey. Our coworkers were giving the manager some very dirty looks. The thing that has always baffled me about this whole exchange is that the hat and shirt were issued by the bakery and had the logo on them, but the pants belonged to girlfriend. Why in the world did she decide to take off the pants too? Okay, so after reading this story 9 times, I can fix her. Okay, I can do it. Anyway, next story. So, where should I start with this one? 2 employees having loud sex in the restroom during shift change, a carpenter getting a BP from someone in finance in the supply room, 2 employees speaking Elvish on the manufacturing line and pretending not to understand English. This went on all the way to their termination. They formally requested all documents be translated into Elvish, sent me hand-scripted letters, PTO requests, etc., and what I assume is Elvish. Then an interviewee kept picking his nose and rolling the boogers between his finger and casually flicking them. He never broke stride in the conversation or picking. I really do not think he realized what he was doing. Then another interviewee who talked about a sticky employee situation he had to deal with and brought up finding adult content on the company network. Horrid, but unfortunately not uncommon. He described it as, and I quote, "not pretty adult content, you know, like bestiality and murder adult content. To each his own, but not at work." My biggest question, though, was, where do you find this stuff? Then a female employee with a coworker getting finger banged, direct quote from witnesses, in a company suite at a Rush concert in front of 20+ employees and customers, after which she yelled, "Big privates are great, but big wallets are better." Best part was, I had to describe the situation to the CEO, a very conservative Mormon man, while discussing damage control with said customers. I literally said digitally penetrated, and he looked puzzled and said, "Huh?" And then dropped finger bang on him, and yeah, he couldn't look at me for months after that. By the way, they got rid of her, but he kept his job. Total BS, but he brought the money in. Next story. This wasn't in my territory, but we had a guy kill someone during his training period. We had a week-long classroom-style training. On Tuesday night, he shot and killed someone in an armed home robbery. He continued to come to training until the police caught him, and the entire thing was caught on the guy's doorbell camera, and it took the police a week to catch him. We found out he was being charged with murder when his manager saw it on the news and called us asking how to proceed. Then we had an HR employee steal upwards of $20,000 over the course of about a year in time card theft. She would clock in when she left her home and stay clocked in throughout her commute. She would often take 2+ hour lunches and leave hours early but stayed clocked in. She would clock in for 12+ hours a day on weekends and claim to be working from home, but would just clock in and basically take the day off. At one point, she spent 20 hours in the office and clocked in for almost 80. It took them about a year to fire her, and they ultimately chose not to sue. Lucky her. Then we had an employee threaten a manager with a gun. I don't know all the details of that one, but something to do with the manager calling him a name and the employee finally having enough of it. I believe we ended up paying the employee a small amount of hush money, so I know it wasn't good. Then we've got a manager, I work in a very blue-collar industry, who's known to ask women who's taking care of their children in interviews. We've got another one who tries to figure out people's ages based on their application and won't interview anyone over 40. There's a third who explicitly said he won't hire women. That's all run-of-the-mill stuff in my industry. Many HR violations, but these guys have to have regular training on why calling someone the N-word because they were 5 minutes late isn't appropriate, so nothing surprises me anymore. And then, this wasn't in my company, but I know someone who had a manager in their department get fired for sexual harassment. It wasn't just your run-of-the-mill inappropriate comments. He would constantly make the one woman on his team work late, overload her with work, and then give her bad reviews on it. He called her names and often would talk about her appearance in front of the team. In an odd turn of events, they slept together and were kind of friends outside of work. She left the company and he was fired very shortly after. They figured she probably would have told HR what was going on in her exit interview and he was fired for it. That wasn't all it was though. Apparently, he'd been hitting on an intern for a couple of months and she took that to HR just before the other girl left. Then, as icing on the cake, he told a woman in another department that he could sleep with her entire department if he wanted, whether they liked it or not, and HR wouldn't do anything about it. Well, he was fired the next day. Textbook case of sexual harassment and a man with a god complex. His termination followed him, and it took him about a year to get another job. He has 2 degrees, a CPA, and a great work history prior to this. Next story. I've got a good one. Last place I worked was a crappy internet company. I was on tech support. The higher-ups fed us all lies to tell customers when their service was bad. The GM at the time was a smile at you when you'd talk to him and then humiliate you in front of everybody kind of boss. And the owner was a family friend of my wife, a youth leader for the church, and young marrieds group. But at work, he was rude and cussed at us, total fake act. I was working a pretty entry-level position at the time, but my wife ended up with a health diagnosis that required us to need more money for treatments, so I set up a meeting with the owner, expressing my struggle and asked for growth opportunities and training to move up in the company. He seemed like he genuinely cared and said we'd talk again soon. Mind you, he spent half of every year in Australia for the youth program, so getting to sit down with him was a rare opportunity. Side note, a few projects he put me on required all of his logins to manage his Yelp page and have him sign off to have a graphic designer paid for a troubleshoot guide that we designed. I sent maybe 7 emails requesting the same info and he would never reply. Anyways, a week goes by and then he calls me into the office. Here I am all stoked for some good news, and he proceeds to point out how the projects he put me on weren't compatible. And I tried to explain the reason, but he didn't want to hear it. And then he began mocking me using a stupid voice about how my wife had health issues and that I needed more money, and laughed at me, tore me a new one, and then fired me on the spot. Of course, I could go into the aftermath, but there is a satisfying ending here. A couple of years later, it comes out that a family in Virginia is pressing charges against him in regards to something he did with an underage girl. Mind you, he's a good-looking guy in his early 30s with a wife and 3 young boys. Turns out he was conducting private Bible studies with some of the girls overseas, having them pray together and then making them pleasure him. Yeah, dude's in jail in Virginia for 7+ years. Your sin always finds you out. Next story. We had to terminate someone after 8 days of employment for very serious misconduct issues, including sexual harassment. When I notified the employee, he started threatening me, the manager, and the entire company. He went on to send threatening emails to the VPs and other senior leadership, threatening a lawsuit. His manager was concerned for her safety, and the company had to hire additional security. Come to find out that the guy we terminated had recently sued his previous employer. This whole thing is still happening, so I don't have an ending to this nightmare yet. Happy Thanksgiving. interesting. Next story. I worked for the civil service in the HR department, and I've had some crazy things. A lot comes to mind, but I suppose the first thing that I thought of was the time that we were clearing out our room of old paperwork, and I was relatively new. Some of the older colleagues were commenting on some of the files we were finding as they remembered the cases. Things like, "Oh, I remember this woman. She got married to this guy in the post office." Or, "This guy got through stage 4 cancer. Good for him." One of the files they picked up, though, they just said casually, "Remember this job? He's the one that stabbed his manager in the face and ended up with a promotion." Crazy. And then they just moved on right past it. I was like, whoa, hold up. I need to hear the end of that story, please. Turns out they were at a Christmas dinner and this guy had a fight with his manager, grabbed a steak knife, and stabbed him in the cheek. Because of some strange circumstances at time in the government who he was connected to, they couldn't or wouldn't fire him, so they decided to transfer him to a different department. Only that there were no more positions left at his grade, and he wouldn't settle for a lower grade. So they ended up promoting him to a higher position, including all benefits and pay. Civil service, eh? Next story. So, there are a lot of stories. But to start, most people lie about why they got fired, which AR really can't contest or correct to others because of confidentiality, which sometimes leads to wild situations. Such as Situation A. Guy was fired for fooling around, read blatant sexual behavior on the clock at work, with a coworker, who was caught by busted coworker, so on the job site it was a well-known secret. Of course, dude goes home and makes up some BS to his wife, who comes in making an absolute scene, threatening lawsuits, etc. As HR, we couldn't say anything at all, but we're pretty sure another employee told her, because we never saw her again. So awkward. Then Situation B. I caught a guy drinking beer that he'd stolen on the job. He admitted it, and we had film. But during his termination, I decided to choose the reason as drinking on the job and not theft. Mostly because I felt bad for the guy, and being terminated for theft can have a negative impact on unemployment payment for years. Basically, I figured this guy effed up, but didn't want to see him punished so severely in the future. Now, since he was fired, he shouldn't receive unemployment money from us, but the idiot filed for it, saying he was unfairly terminated. But of course, I can share the details with the judge, so she got the full story in film. And he's right there and admits it again. So now not only is the unemployment denied, the theft incident is on his record, so even if he rightfully files in the future, his payments will be less. I know, and look folks, I know HR can get a bad rap, and like any other field, there are bad practitioners out there, but many of us try very hard to do the right thing for the employees. Next story. I used to work for AT&T as a salesperson in one of their stores. One night during a closing shift, I had a customer get really rude with me and start cussing at me about his bill. Nothing really unusual about that. His kids had burned through all of their data, and he, as an older, middle-aged redneck dad, didn't understand the why or how of the additional charges on his bill. This was a pretty regular issue in our store, but this guy started getting in my face and trying to physically intimidate me, so I told him he would have to leave the store or I was going to call the police. He then grabbed a rack of cell phone cases and threw it on the ground and then cussed his way out of the door. My coworker and I finished out the shift and locked up as usual. I was off the next day, but he came in the day after, and my assistant manager asked to see me in the back. He told me that the customer had returned the day after his tantrum and told him, the assistant manager, that after he left, he waited in the parking lot for me to kick my ass, but then called a friend of his at the local sheriff's department to find out how much his bail would be if he did so, and ultimately decided it was not worth the price tag. The assistant manager then credited the man's account, reducing his bill by the amount of the data overage charges, and told him I would write him an apology, which was to be collected by the customer that day. I was shocked. I told the AM that I would do no such thing, and I would be reporting the incident to HR. He said I could do that, but he wished I would just let it go and get on with my day. But I got in touch with HR, filed my complaint, received a single correspondence email from them saying they were looking into it, and then never heard from them again. I called them twice more and was both times told that it was an open investigation, so I quit about a month later after a customer casually referred to Michelle Obama as an N-word and a B-word right in front of me, and the same assistant manager laughed. F AT&T. Next story. One of my company's own HR reps had to be redirected into a different job, and then finally requested to resign after the following incident. So, a coworker of mine is originally from Hawaii, and her son still lives there. After the ACA was passed in Congress, she went into HR to put her son under her insurance. He was still under 26 at the time, so he was newly qualified under the law. This particular HR rep told my coworker that she actually couldn't put her son on the insurance since he didn't live in the United States. Next story. The last company I worked for did not have an HR department. My boss was one of the worst people I have ever met, and if they did have HR, she would have been gone a long time ago. The one incident that made me hightail it out of there was she used a doctor's note of mine to get out of a class she was taking. A month or so before, I had a miscarriage at 18 weeks and had to have D&C. My doctor wrote me a note for work so I could have 2 weeks for recovery and time to process what had just happened. I found multiple doctored copies of my doctor's note on the printer, though. The dates were changed, and a part in the note excusing me from work was changed to class. I remember seeing it and my heart dropped, and I immediately had anxiety. I also thought at first someone else was going through the same thing until I looked at it closer and realized it was mine. I felt extremely used and exposed. A coworker of mine actually walked in on her trying to fix it up on the computer. I ended up telling the CEO because that was her boss. I left my coworker out of the story because she was a single mom and my boss was lenient with her hours, so I didn't want her to make it harder on her. But he encouraged me to talk to her about it, which I did, and they played it off like she didn't do it. I was told it was in the executive drive, so only the executives could get to it. Well, my boss was the only female executive, and it was a doctor's note from an OBGYN, and she was the only one taking a class. So they basically offered me a raise and a title change after that. I took it knowing I was trying for a baby and wanted to have the money to save up. Going back, I wish I would have held my ground and quit though. Next story. So my boss told me about this one. I don't work in HR, but this involved HR at my job. But we had one hourly employee that wasn't performing well and was butting heads with his new boss, one of the assistant directors in our department. He was pretty arrogant and would pawn his work off on the student employees. He would just sit around watching YouTube or ESPN on his phone. He'd been given all of the formal warnings and such, so he should have been expected to get fired. Then my boss, his boss's boss, and his boss had planned on terminating him near the end of the day. HR sends out letters for terminations that are normally presented by the boss in person. For some reason, the process had been ran differently, and the letter had been taken to the mailroom by HR. Our department is pretty close to the mailroom, so we see when mail is delivered. His letter was put in his mailbox around noon, and one of the student workers gave him his mail. He read it and flipped out. He started walking through the hallway saying, "Well, I guess I'm effing fired, F this place." And he did this for a solid half hour before my boss found out. She was at lunch. When my boss got wind of the situation, she went to try and calm him down and de-escalate the situation. He then threw some of his personal items across the room, told my boss he was coming after her job next, then cussed out all of his coworkers and employees, cussed out HR, and cussed out the president on his way out. The bad thing is, though, HR was going to offer him the chance to resign rather than being terminated, because there are very few jobs in our industry in the area, and jobs are hard enough to come by without a termination. Plus, his wife didn't work, so they were going to let him stay on our insurance for longer than COBRA mandates. My boss still offered him that option too, as he threw a keyboard at her. Needless to say, he didn't take the offer. I worked from home during this time frame, so I had no idea any of it happened until like a year later. Next story. My mom doesn't Reddit, so I will type this out for her, but she said, "We received an outside email with a photo attachment. The photograph was of a nurse we employed with what looked like a glass pipe or some sort on her lap. The email alleged that she was an addict. We later find out that it came from an ex-girlfriend she had just broken up with. It prompted us to go seek out the nurse. When we arrived at her desk, she was on the phone with a patient, but visibly nodding off. We requested she come to the HR office with us to talk. Then we confronted her with the allegation. She denied everything and agreed to do a drug test. Instead of sending her to an outside lab, we had one send technicians to our office building to administer the test, and that's when things went south. She began telling us that she needed to go out to her car. We believe this was because she planned to use synthetic urine or someone else's, and us not sending her to an outside lab lost her the opportunity to do that. And we flatly told her that leaving the bathroom would be noted as a refusal to take the test, which would mean an automatic termination. This woman proceeded to throw a tantrum on the floor of the bathroom for the next 7 hours of the day. We had to shut down that entire bathroom. Other employees started a rumor we were holding a pregnant woman hostage. And at lunchtime, she demanded a meal. So I went to the cafeteria, purchased her a sandwich and drink, and then she ate it on the bathroom floor. After hours of tears and yelling, 5 p.m. rolled around. She calmly stood up and said, "It's the end of my shift, so I'll be leaving now." And we repeated to her that leaving would still be considered a refusal and grounds for immediate termination. At this time, the technician, who had also been there watching all of this last for 7 hours, tried to intervene and talk some sense into her. Eventually, she reluctantly agreed to a buccal swab rather than a urine test, and then she left for the day. Needless to say, the results we got back were positive, and she was terminated as well as reported to the licensing boards. I thought that was the end of it until several weeks later when she called to complain her insurance card was no longer valid and she couldn't pick up her prescription. This turned into an hour-long discussion about how losing employment means also losing the benefits. Well, folks, those are the HR stories. Let us know what you think. If you've got any of your own HR stories or something similar, go ahead and share it in the comment section. I like reading those. But anyway, guys, thank you all so much for watching, commenting. Have a really good day, and bye-bye!